BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays, I talk to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And in this episode, I will be discussing Najib Halaby as a D.B. Cooper suspect, responding to the Friday Beers video on D.B. Cooper, and of course continuing our discussions with the Cooper Profile segment, which is all about the psychological profiling of skyjackers. And please, stick around until the end, because you might hear the most outrageous story that has ever aired on Black Box Online Radio. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about D.B. Cooper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. And I would like to let you guys know that there are other segments here on Black Box Online Radio. Every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer. And if you're curious about the Zodiac case, I want to tell you that today's episode is partially sponsored by Michael Cole, a friend of the show and author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy. If the Zodiac mystery fascinates you, please check out the Zodiac Revisited trilogy anywhere you get your true crime books, including Spotify and Amazon.com. And if you enjoy the series, please help out Michael by leaving a 5-star review. But I want to talk about D.B. Cooper right now and share something very honest with you guys. When I started Cooper Friday, I made the decision that I was going to try and cover every single D.B. Cooper suspect out there. And that is a big challenge because new suspects are popping up all the time. We also have other suspects who might not have been 100% eliminated, but they are very questionable. And thankfully, there's something called the D.B. Cooper Suspect WordPress that has not only arranged and organized all the suspects, but ratings have also been attributed to them about their likelihood of being D.B. Cooper, the man who skyjacked Flight 305 back in 1971 and made off with $200,000. And the lowest ranked suspect is Najeeb Halaby. I was saving him for the end. Maybe I thought he would be the final suspect profile that I would do for Cooper Friday, but I'm going to be very honest with you guys. I let curiosity get the better of me, and it's not always a bad thing, but the top ratings on the D.B. Cooper Suspect WordPress are a 5. Some suspects have a 5. The lowest rated suspect is Najib Halaby, who gets a 0.1 or 0.10, depending on your outlook on life. But I actually found that there are some strong points in favor of him being D.B. Cooper. Najib Halaby might be more famous for being the father of Queen Noor of Jordan, and she married King Hussein of Jordan and became Queen Noor. But as you can tell from his name, he was of Arab-American descent. His father was from Syria, but his ethnicity was Syrian-Lebanese. But he was born and raised in the United States, and he went on to become not only a pioneer in aviation, but a record breaker. He went from someone who was a lifelong aviator, if you will, to becoming an aviation executive, becoming the head of Pan Am and head of the FAA. But let's look at some things that have been written about him on the Texas State Historical Society website, Texas State Historical Association. The Life and Legacy of Najib Halaby by Cynthia Marshall Devlin, just citing the source. Najib Halaby was born in 1915 and he passed away in 2003. The D.B. Cooper skyjacking took place in 1971. So that would mean, I'm going to try the math this time because I'm not good at math, but that would mean that if he's born in 1915, he would be 56 years old at the time of the skyjacking. And if you were to approach me before I started Cooper Friday and ask me, what do you think about a 56-year-old D.B. Cooper? I would mostly tell you that that sounds like he's too old, to be honest. But if people are going to strongly entertain Milton Vordahl as a D.B. Cooper suspect, he was 58 years old at the time of the skyjacking. So Najib Halaby deserves consideration. He was born under the name Najib Elias Halaby Jr. He went by the nickname Jeeb. He was a record-breaking U.S. Navy pilot, law school graduate, and head of the Federal Aviation Agency and the CEO of Pan Am Worldways. He was born in Dallas, Texas on November 19th of 1915 to Najib Sr. and to Laura Wilkins, a native Texan. His father immigrated to America in 1891 from Syria, which was part of the Ottoman Empire. You know, it's so crazy to talk about D.B. Cooper and have an Ottoman Empire connection, 1891. Goodness. But I think a lot of the suspects might have parents and siblings, and mostly parents who were born in some similar time frames. Not all of them, as we're going to see, but some. His mother was born on a Texas ranch and attended a Southern Methodist church, and his father was a Syrian Christian. His mother studied at Southern Methodist University, where she studied art, and Halaby's parents established Halaby Galleries as part of Neiman Marcus. Inspired by Charles Lindbergh's solo transatlantic flight, Halaby was drawn to aviation and made his first solo flight in a biplane over Mansfield, Los Angeles when he was 16. He received his pilot license when he was 17 in 1933, and he graduated from Lee Lanau School, a boarding education school in Michigan. He completed a degree in political science from Stanford in 1937, and he got his law degree from Yale in 1940. Halaby practiced law in Los Angeles, but during World War II he joined the U.S. Navy and worked as a test pilot. So I'm seeing some major things here that do stand out in terms of strong points for being D.B. Cooper. The first is, he is someone who has a very, very wide array of aviation connections. He is not just a pilot, aviation enthusiast. He's also going to be someone who's going to be working with aviation throughout his career. As I said, aviation executive. And Najib Halaby would also go on to write a memoir called Crosswinds, which is more or less the story of an airman. And this is not just some guy who had a strong understanding of aviation. It seems like he had a lifelong expert's understanding of aviation. And that's what we see from D.B. Cooper. Because when D.B. Cooper is on the plane, he actually has just the inside out knowledge of the Boeing 727. He knows where the oxygen tanks are. He says that he wants the flaps at a certain angle. He wants the landing gear down, the cabin depressurized. These are not things that just some casual aviation enthusiast might think about, unless they were just really, really smart, really, really sharp. But, I mean, with somebody like Najib Halaby, he would have known about all of those things, and just like off the top of his head, and it would be second nature. Now, there is one thing, and I'm going to address the elephant in the room. You might be wondering about something. He does not seem to resemble the D.B. Cooper composite sketches, and I don't mean that lightly. I can see how, if you were to combine certain features from Composites A, Composite B, and Composite C and put them together, you might have somebody that would look like Najib Halaby. But overall, I think that he's just so different than all of the sketches. Definitely Composite A with the narrow nose. And Composite B also just seems to have a much flatter face, and Najib Halaby's facial features are very protruding. Composite C, a little bit, but a very, very different hairline, depending on his haircut on November 24th of 1971. But moreover, let me talk about something that I think might be a reasonable point. And as Eric Eulis once said about his suspect, Vince Peterson, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but he was an unattractive man. And the flight attendants, Tina Mucklow and Florence Shafter and Alice Hancock, said that D.B. Cooper was reportedly unattractive. They did not think that he had attractive features. Now, I'm not good at rating men's appearances. I'm really not. But if somebody were to look at Najib Halaby, who was like a 22-year-old woman, maybe she would think that he was unattractive. I said, though, I would talk about the elephant in the room issue, and that is just that I find that his appearance is different in a way that would be noticed more easily by the flight attendants. Everything about his physical appearance is large and bulky. I already said that his facial features are protruding, and I don't see that type of stuff in the witness statements and the witness descriptions. Furthermore, Najib Halaby might have something that is going to explain why he was the lowest rated D.B. Cooper suspect on the suspect's WordPress. And that is that On November 24th of 1971, he had a meeting with the president, with Richard Nixon, except it's possible that the times might actually conflict where he wouldn't have had enough time to go to the meeting and then end up in Portland to skyjack the plane. His alibi might literally have been the President of the United States. But, I mean, I've really found, though, that just reading about his story, and I've gone through not only the Historical Society website, but just looking at all the usual pages, as well as having a quick glance at his book, Crosswinds. I think it was Ryan Burns who said that one of the most fascinating parts of the D.B. Cooper case is you get exposed to all of these enormous characters and these personalities that you perhaps wouldn't have been reading about otherwise. But I mean, Najib Halaby is someone who seems like he had just a very, very big career, an illustrious career. But this actually might be a strike against him for being D.B. Cooper, because it's the same problem that we see with other D.B. Cooper suspects like E. Howard Hunt. They were public figures. And it's not only the flight attendants, it's not only Alice Hancock, Tina Mucklow, and Florence Schaffner. There were also other passengers on the plane who might have recognized him from some public event and came forward and be like, yeah, I saw that guy on the TV. I saw him getting sworn in to being head of the Federal Aviation Agency or something like that, and remembering things and connecting the dots. And it's also just, that is a strike against him. So the long story short is, I'm not completely shocked and caught off guard that Najeeb Halaby is the lowest ranking D.B. Cooper suspect. But it does seem like, he had a very large career, and perhaps we can talk about some of these things in a future episode, like trying to make a cross-country flight at record speed and record time. He was a record-breaking aviator, and, some of that stuff is pretty cool. I don't know the guy personally, so I often try to withhold judgment because sometimes you want to say that somebody is really cool and you find out some bad things about them. But I told you in this episode I was also going to be discussing a video from the channel Friday Beers. And I've seen one video from them in the past, and their channel is exactly what it says. There are 3 guys, and 2 of them drink 12 beers while they're talking about unsolved mysteries. I've watched their Zodiac Killer video, and it was not my favorite YouTube video ever. I'll just leave it at that. I actually thought the D.B. Cooper video was much better, and I think it's because they didn't make it about the suspects. They made it just about the story of D.B. Cooper, but they have a host who provides them with information, and 2 guys will drink 12 beers throughout the duration of the recording, but they changed one thing up because they had to have 1 bourbon and soda, 1 bourbon and 7-Up, in honor of D.B. Cooper. So the first thing that I noticed from the Friday Beers channel was that the D.B. Cooper story is something that requires a lot of attention to detail. It's a very precise narrative, because they're starting out by saying, okay, so this guy D.B. Cooper has a bomb on the plane. How did he get on the plane when he had a bomb wrapped around his chest? And then the host is like, okay, well, the bomb wasn't wrapped around his chest. It was in a briefcase. And then someone says, well, how did he get on there with this bomb that's just beeping in the briefcase? Beep, beep, beep. Didn't somebody say, hey, DB, your briefcase is beeping? And then the guy says, well, he didn't actually go by D.B. Cooper when he was on the plane. When he bought the ticket, he used the name Dan Cooper. And they seem to be under the misapprehension that D.B. Cooper was just a pure accident, that somebody just wrote down the name D.B. Cooper and it was all done as just a giant mistake. But as I understand, D.B. Cooper was a real person. He was someone who lived in the Pacific Northwest, and he was just one of the first people that they decided to investigate. And of course he wasn't Dan Cooper, but the media got those 2 names backwards. They took his name by mistake and then put it on there. So it's not just like somebody made up D.B. Cooper out of thin air. It was based on a real person's name. And finally, though, they actually got to discussing the facts, the events, and the analyses. And the first point was, did D.B. Cooper have a real bomb when he was on the plane? And one of the guys says, if somebody opened up a briefcase and you saw a bunch of wires, you would probably take the threat seriously. Was it a dud? There's very high chance that it was a dud. But if you saw real wires and what appeared to have been a bomb, I don't necessarily know how good someone would be at making a bomb or a fake bomb, but if it looked convincing, you would have to comply. I'm like, excellent. That's excellent. So many people give that type of response when they're asked, did DB Cooper have a real bomb? They just say, it doesn't really matter too much because they would have had to have gone along with his requests and demands no matter what. Otherwise, something catastrophic would have happened. And we're going to hear all about that in the Cooper Profile Skyjackers segment. But as they continue to discuss this, I noticed that one of the participants really began to zone in on something. And I don't know why this happens, but Pat Brown did it in her psychological profile. Simon Whistler did it in his video, which I've done direct responses to. And it's that they're like, wait a second. This guy, DB Cooper, he knew a lot about airplanes. He really seems like somebody who worked in the aviation industry. Although the Friday Beers guys seemed to think that there was something a little bit different going on because Simon Whistler and Pat Brown were mostly saying, I'm not seeing much of a military background. I think this guy's more of a Boeing employee. And Friday Beers didn't say any specific company, but they were like, I think this guy worked in the aviation industry. Maybe he worked for the airport. Maybe he even worked on the tarmac, or he was an air traffic controller, or as like the Najeeb Halaby type, some type of executive that was also thrown into the mix. But as I said, they didn't discuss the suspects. But a big difference between Friday Beers and the previously two mentioned hosts that I talked about is that they were actually sticking to the military background. They're like, yes, he's an aviation employee. He works in the aviation sector, but he was most likely a veteran. And I think that that's a very fair observation, although they seem to think that he was a Korean War veteran. And I mean, that's entirely possible, but let's look at the time frame. In the 1930s and 40s, we have World War II. The USA is mostly involved in World War II after 1941, right? Well, of course, World War II started much earlier. Then we have Korea, 1950 to 1953, and then at the end of the 1950s, the Vietnam starts. The Vietnam conflict starts. Some people would say Vietnam went from 1957 to 1975. All right, though. So Vietnam might actually be a much more likely military background for DB Cooper, and a lot of people think that Cooper was a Vietnam vet. We've talked about it all the time on Cooper Friday, but I think they were trying to estimate things based on Cooper's projected age, that perhaps he was a Korean War veteran that had some type of connection to aviation and the military. All of that stuff is fine. But one thing that I really do like about these types of channels is they are true crime followers, but they don't necessarily follow the same case for very long. They look into one case for one episode and then move on. So it's really interesting to see the fresh set of eyes on the subject. And that's exactly what I'm doing now on Thursdays for the Black Dahlia segments. Dahlia Thursday here on Black Box Online Radio. One more time, I invite you to hit the like button and subscribe. But with them, these guys are even just unfamiliar with the story, like they're getting the information provided to them. What do you think about this? And they were saying, you know what? I think this guy, DB Cooper, was either really smart or really dumb, but on the side of being smart. And this is the part that I truly love. It's almost as if DB Cooper was of above average intelligence, but he was trying to make it seem like he was not very smart. And again, there are two participants. One of them was thinking that DB Cooper just made it up the night before because the day before Thanksgiving is called Blackout Wednesday. They even called it Black Wednesday, but Blackout Wednesday, where people go to the bar. And from talking about other true crime cases on Black Box Online Radio, I can confirm that there's a lot of crime that happens the day before Thanksgiving because people are anticipating about robbing people who work in bars and so on. And it's also a day when people go out and get very drunk. He was thinking maybe on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, somebody went to the bar and had an idea, and then they thought about, all right, this is a way to obtain money. This is like a bigger way of obtaining any type of money, and they quickly dismissed that theory. And to come back to the stronger one that I was just discussing about how Cooper is smart, but he's trying to play like he's dumb. DB Cooper left his clip-on tie on the plane, and one of them was saying, everything about Cooper seems to be very professional. This is the good stuff, mind you. He seems like someone who would have known how to tie a tie. If he's going to be working in the aviation sector, if he were ex-military, I mean, if he were a business executive, let's say somebody like a Najib Halaby type, You would think that he would know how to tie his own tie, yet he used a clip-on, and he left it behind on the airplane. And they were like, maybe. He expected that he would not be able to leave any real evidence behind, and it was a pure false lead. Maybe Cooper's tie was just the biggest dud out of everything, that he wants to leave trails of confusing evidence that will lead to absolutely nowhere. And I do kind of agree that I would think that D.B. Cooper would be able to tie a tie if he's ex-military and he has some type of professional job. But you never know. And I also want to be clear that it's possible for somebody to know how to tie a tie and still own a clip-on. I own one clip-on tie. The rest of them I can actually tie myself, but I do own one clip-on tie that's back in some drawer in West Virginia. But I mean, that could just be it. It was the tie that he didn't care about anymore. It was something that was old and he didn't want to wear it because it meant nothing to him. That could be another alternative possibility. But then the next part I thought was really interesting because they kept going with this type of false lead or this type of red herring that is planted by Cooper. And they're like, what if D.B. Cooper planted the money at Tina Bar and that he did that years later purely as a way to just create another false distraction? If anybody found the money, it would be in a completely inappropriate place, not near the flight path, not near the expected drop zone. And again, it's just something confusing where people are just going to have no idea what to do. Again, Cooper's really smart, but he's acting like he's not. He knows how to leave confusing trails. One thing that they seem to be very hung up on was, why was $5,800 of D.B. Cooper's money found in 1980? And ultimately, it was not 5,800, right? It's now widely accepted that it was indeed 6,000, so they're thinking of all these stories. Maybe somebody took, I guess $200 and they tried to use it and it was too damaged or something like that. We don't even have to entertain things like that. One theory that was very briefly discussed in this episode was maybe Cooper was using it as his hiding spot during the entire time, and occasionally he's going back to Tina Bar every so often to get money. I've never liked this. It's not the first time I've heard that, and it's probably not the first time that you've heard that either. Did D.B. Cooper just use Tina Bar as his hiding spot for the money, and he's coming back later to claim some of it whenever he wants it? I think that that's ridiculous because the money was uncovered. If you're going to do that, you're going to protect the money. Because look what happened to the money at Tina Bar. It was all in shards and fragments. And they were even asking the question, well, why didn't the Ingrams just take it? These were a bunch of pieces of paper that were falling apart. Absolutely, you couldn't use something like that. The bills were too degraded. So they came forward with it, and ultimately, it was identified as D.B. Cooper's money. Now, in terms of Cooper being really smart, but making people think that he's dumb, he said that he wanted to fly to Mexico City. And they were like, nah, I think that's a red herring too, because the pilots are telling him, well, we have to have some type of stopover. We can't make it all the way to Mexico with the fuel in the Boeing 727. So ultimately they agreed upon Reno, Nevada. And they were like, I think this guy wanted to fly to Reno the whole time. He wanted to go down that flight path for a particular reason. And they're all saying this as what if, like, what if he wanted to go down that flight path heading southbound over southern Washington and northern Oregon, and that's his whole intention. I'm like, I love it. Absolute newcomers to the case who are a little bit drunk, but I love it. I mean, it makes so much sense. I've talked about it before on Cooper Friday. In fact, I think a lot of that is my go-to theory that D.B. Cooper wanted to go southbound. And he also jumped relatively quickly, and you could even estimate that amount of time just by counting if you truly tried. And then he jumps out over southern Washington, and the rest is history, because he had a relative idea of where he was, but he just wanted to go southbound from Seattle. And they're like, maybe he knew the flight path, maybe he knew exactly where the plane would be. Entirely possible. I mean, Cooper knew a lot about aviation. So overall, yeah, the Friday Beers channel is very silly. They get drunk and they talk about mysteries. But overall, I actually thought that they were raising some good points in this one. And I absolutely think it was to their benefit to not talk about the suspects, because in the Zodiac Killer episode, one guy just latched on to Arthur Lee Allen as his suspect, and he's bringing all the evidence back to Arthur Lee Allen. And I'm like, well, maybe yes, maybe no. And then another one was making his own theory about how, the Zodiac misspelled the word Christmas with two S's, SS, that's like the Nazis. And he's trying to make this whole theory about how the Zodiac Killer was a Nazi and white supremacist and so on. And I was like, that's also an impractical methodology. I mean, you're both just kind of pre-choosing a suspect, or in the other example, pre-choosing a theory, and then you're just trying to make the evidence fit. So by just looking at the evidence and allowing it to speak for itself, I think that it was actually a much better discussion. But what do you think about anything that I've just shared with you right now? That D.B. Cooper was really smart, and that he was kind of pretending to be dumb by like leaving the tie behind. And what do you think about DB Cooper also withholding certain knowledge, like he knew exactly where the plane was going to fly so he could jump at the time that he wanted? And also, what do you think about DB Cooper leaving very, very calculated red herrings? The tie and the money at Tina Bar, that this is all done by Cooper to be extremely confusing. Like he has just rigged this whole thing so nobody will ever figure it out. Really smart, but he was able to hide his intelligence. Please share anything you want about that theory in the comment section down below, and I would love to read it. And right now we are moving on to the Cooper Profile segment, which is something that I talk about here on Black Box Online Radio every Friday. I usually conclude the episodes with the Cooper Profile, where I go through the writings of Dr. David G. Hubbard, who wrote the book The Skyjacker. And this is a book that really tried to make psychological profiles of skyjackers, and it tried to be the groundbreaking book for psychological profiling in this context, because skyjacking only really started in the 20th century, and they didn't really understand how and why these criminals were thinking. So what David G. Hubbard did was he interviewed countless skyjackers, he did assessments on skyjackers, and last week on the channel, I told you about a female skyjacker named Gladys, and she is the first female skyjacker that is mentioned in the book. And this is almost unfair because Gladys had a partner named George, and George is the subject of the chapter that I just went through for this one now. And as I said, this might be the most ridiculous story that I've ever shared on Black Box Online Radio. George is somebody who grows up in an unstable household. He has an alcoholic father, like many skyjackers do, and his father is somebody who actually starts out as a hardworking businessman, but he realizes that he's never going to be promoted to the executive level. Perhaps he keeps getting turned down for promotions, but that's the way that it's phrased in the book. He's never going to be an executive, so he turned to drinking. George had an older half-sister who was from his mother's previous relationship. So George is the biological son of the father, and the father has a stepdaughter. This is also rather different than the early segments that I've talked about on the Cooper Profile, where the majority of skyjackers had a very large family, and that the skyjacker was somewhere in the middle of the birth order. Lately on the Cooper Profile, I've been talking about a lot of, let's say, two-child households and so on, and George is no exception. He has an older half-sister, and his father develops this very bizarre type of dynamic where he resents the stepdaughter. He does not like the stepdaughter, and he gets drunk and he destroys her things. One thing that George is very keen to note is that he doesn't actually hurt the children, and it's not like Gladys where she said, oh yeah, he doesn't actually hurt us, except, I mean, he hits me, but he doesn't hurt us. No, like, he is very aware of what's going on. George is saying that the father goes in to his sister's closet and he just tears her clothes apart when he's drunk. And then what happens with George is something that's actually very tragic and very saddening. He wants the attention of his mother, but she prefers her firstborn, her daughter. And his father's like, come here, son. Life is about men versus women. Life is about boys versus girls. It's us versus them. And George is just thinking, you're a drunk who tears apart my sister's clothes. I don't want to spend time with you. So the attention that he wants, he doesn't get. The attention that he gets, he doesn't want. And this also leads to some very bizarre things that happen in school. George is someone who seems reasonably intelligent, but he's a very poor student, and it's all very, very similar to Gladys, his girlfriend, because she is someone who said something to the effect of, when you're in class, they have your body, but they don't have your mind. And also, George really begins to notice that the education that we receive in the K through 12 system in America doesn't necessarily prepare you for life. And a lot of people do deal with this. If you go back to some of my Jack the Ripper episodes, I did one called Was Francis Thompson Jack the Ripper? It's a two-part one where I discuss the book Jack the Poet by Simon Webb, and there's a sentence that's in the book. Success in the classroom does not translate to success in the workplace. And with George, it's really just like the life skills from the classroom do not translate to life skills in the workplace. And he really finds that there are a lot of conflicts that education does not provide solutions to. It doesn't show him how to deal with interpersonal relations. So George really struggles with this throughout his life, and he ultimately ends up in a relationship when he is in his early years of college, but he ends up leaving that girl when he meets Gladys. And the way that Gladys described him as a bad boy wearing ripped jeans and so on, but the way that George just seems to describe her is, at first it seems like he doesn't really care, but they have a lot of physical chemistry, and then some things just kind of ignite, and they develop a very strong attachment and a very strong bond. And Dr. David G. Hubbard even remarks that this is one of the healthiest relationships that seems to be going on with his skyjacking examples that he has found. But then we actually get to the skyjacking. So George and Gladys are in this relationship, and then George realizes, you know what, it's really unfair that we live in this first world North American nation. This is not a good way for us to live, and he gets influenced by communism and by Marxism. And his thinking gets almost contaminated in a way, literally and metaphorically speaking, as we're going to see. So the plan that they have to skyjack this airplane involves two weapons, a paring knife and a can of insecticide, like pesticide, bug poison. And George is on the plane and he says, I want to be flown to Cuba, otherwise I'm going to release this poisonous substance. And you can actually see in the book The Skyjacker where the word laughter is put in parentheses, where people were actually laughing at him. But at the same time, they had somebody threatening them, and the knife was mostly used to threaten the female flight attendants, so they had to comply to a certain degree. But George and Gladys experienced something that was very similar to what D.B. Cooper experienced on the plane in 1971. They didn't have enough fuel to fly to Cuba, and they agreed on a stopover in Miami. And this is something where things are going to take a very drastic turn. George is overpowered, and he has the can of bug poison, he has the knife, and he gets separated from Gladys. She gets locked out of the cockpit with no weapons, and he has an opportunity to fight back, but he doesn't. He almost forfeits. He almost just gives up, and ultimately they're both taken into custody. And then he gets questioned about this. It's all in the book, The Skyjacker. Well, why didn't you use the knife? Why didn't you release this powerful, poisonous substance that could be used to kill cockroaches and flies? And he just says his plan was never to hurt anyone. He really just wanted to go to Cuba to, again, be a sugarcane farmer and to live with Gladys. So ultimately, that is the end of their skyjacking journey. And they were incarcerated, they're sent to prison, they were separated, and they experienced a lot of emotional turmoil being separated as romantic partners, but ultimately they have no one to blame but themselves. Do you know the saying, right? Have you guys ever heard this? Crime does not pay. Well, unless you're D.B. Cooper. Crime doesn't pay for George and Gladys, but it pays for D.B. Cooper. Maybe D.B. Cooper was smarter than everyone, playing chess when other people were playing checkers, and George and Gladys were not even playing checkers. They tried to skyjack a plane with a knife and a can of bug repellent. I mean, it's not repellent, though. It was bug poison, to be fair. And ultimately, their plan did not work. But, this really goes to show that it seems like it's almost a plan that was just doomed for failure. Maybe they just wanted some way, somehow, to get out of the lives that they were living in. And I really do think that there's a certain sense of fairness in this. But some of the observations that have been made by Dr. David G. Hubbard relate to how they were planning this, because George is somebody who has developed a lot of communist thinking, a lot of Marxist thinking, and he's one of the few examples in this book of somebody who has a strong political motive, even if you might not believe it or accept it, that he is opposed to working conditions in North America. I mean, he said he did this because he thought that they were living a privileged life in North America, and they wanted to live a simpler life that was perhaps done in the communist tradition. That's why they want to go to Cuba. He's one of the few people who has stated that he has a clear motive that is politically related. Most of the people that I've talked about during the Cooper Profile segment have been dealing with some type of personal, internalized issue. They've been dealing with something that relates to some type of dysfunction in their lives. Their marriages are falling apart. They're dealing with financial trouble. Maybe they've also are dealing with something like they have a prison warrant out for their arrest and they don't want to go to jail. Those types of issues have come up a lot. But this appears to be somebody who didn't actually have the pressure folding in on him. I mean, he could have just kept on working a menial job for the rest of his life, the way that a lot of hard-working people do. They just kind of accept, okay, I might never be rich, but, I'm going to have a place to live. And he had a partner whom he lost because of the skyjacking. So it really just goes to show that there is almost a certain degree of self-sabotage. And if you're going to skyjack a plane with a knife and a can of bug repellent, yes, that is a certain degree of self-sabotage. Interestingly, though, last week on the Cooper Profile, I told you that Gladys had a brother that would threaten her with a knife when her family was not around. And he would say, "I'm not your brother," and so on, like he threatens to hurt her. She used the same knife for the skyjacking. She provided it to George, the exact same knife that her brother threatened her with. And it came back to this concept of the thing that she thought was big and scary and could hurt you, and it was kind of in the back of her mind. And I think it's very clear and apparent that Dr. David G. Hubbard is a Freudian psychiatrist. So he really looks for these types of symbols, and he looks for these types of ideas that perhaps come from Freud and maybe even before. But they're looking at how everything is just a collection of experiences from the past, and sometimes things can be blown out of proportion, because at this point in the book, Dr. David G. Hubbard openly wants to talk about what skyjacking is, and this is very relevant to somebody like Cooper, even more so than Gladys and George, because he points out that almost all skyjackers have been male, and I don't even think it's fair to call Gladys a true skyjacker. She did it, but in terms of this Freudian discussion, I think she only did it because her boyfriend put her up to it, because her boyfriend wanted to do this, and she was the accomplice. It's his guiding force that caused the skyjacking. But ultimately, I think Gladys has some different psychological operations going on. But with people like George and D.B. Cooper, and perhaps all of the Cooper copycats and even Paul Sini, Dr. David G. Hubbard openly wants to say, what is skyjacking? If you're still listening to this episode of Cooper Friday, I will ask you, what is skyjacking? And he says, skyjacking is a form of unconscious rape, usually committed by a timid man. And I'm just like, oh my goodness. I know, Freudian psychology. The actions and behaviors of your parents between the ages of 0 and 4 modeled your behavior and your attitudes and your personality and your sexuality. And Dr. David G. Hubbard really tries to get into this stuff, saying skyjackers are people who did not experience joy in their lives, so they wanted to put themselves above the earth, literally and metaphorically speaking, and they wanted to experience the ecstasy of flying because they never had it in their dreams. And now they're unconsciously committing rape. Skyjacking is a form of unconscious rape, usually committed by a timid man. I actually think that Cooper was a fairly timid man. Based on the descriptions, he does not seem to be overly abrasive. He's described as rather polite. Florence Schaffner even says, "Can I come back on the plane to get my purse?" He says that's fine. But this type of unconscious rape, I mean, I know what he's going at. But one big problem that people have with these Freudian observations is you could say that about anything. Anytime someone is trying to dominate someone, anytime somebody is trying to gain some type of advantage in a situation. You're committing an act of unconscious rape. You are mad at one of your parents. You want to kill another one of your parents. So now you're trying to dominate somebody, and that's an act of unconscious rape. And I have realized that there is a certain arguable and defendable claim to specific aspects of Sigmund Freud's teachings. Not all of it, but with something like this, it's just so malleable. It's so flexible. You could bend anything into this definition of unconscious rape committed by a timid man. So it's a little bit hard for somebody to ingest just purely at face value. If you do ever read this book, The Skyjacker, you might just have some moments when you're like, oh my goodness, here we go, not again, because it's just getting more and more complex with the types of bizarre metaphors. But is this really what skyjacking is all about? You could even say, you know what, the airplane represents the penis, right? And D.B. Cooper wants to dominate his masculine side. That's why he just wants to ride the giant flying penis all the way to Reno. You're gonna be a star. But wait, there could be other forces at work, and this could also just be something as simple as, well, D.B. Cooper knew how to use a parachute, so he wanted to jump out because he thought they could never find him. Maybe all of the guys at Friday Beers were right. Cooper was really smart and he was ahead of the game. Now, interestingly, though, about the statements that I shared in regards to D.B. Cooper committing in regards to D.B. Cooper possibly not having any dreams about flying, because that's what it says on the Skyjacker. Skyjackers very rarely had dreams about flying. They more frequently had dreams about falling and about being paralyzed. And I just have to share this on a personal note. I had a dream recently where I was paralyzed. I have had very, very few dreams where I've been flying, almost none, zero that I can recall. I can only recall one specific dream where I was falling, but I've had numerous dreams where I've been paralyzed. And I was on a sailboat that was on a lake, and there were all of these fish, like dozens of them, and it was called a muskellunge. And I don't even remember what a muskellunge looks like. I saw a picture of it as a kid. Right now, I mean, I think I can kind of visualize it, but just a little bit. I can recall what it looked like in the dream, but there were just dozens and dozens of them. And then under our sailboat went two whales, maybe belugas, two white whales like Moby Dick. And I'm like, okay, firstly, there are whales in the lake. That's not normal. But if these whales go upward, they're going to destroy the sailboat. And then there were a bunch of moose that were starting to swim in the lake. And then I'm like, this is pretty cool. I've got the moose, I've got the whales, and I've got the muskellunge. I know this isn't a setup for a weird Woody Allen joke, but then I was like, I guess I'll get off the sailboat now for some reason. It's a dream. So there was this canvas door that almost had like blue canvas and plastic on it, and I had to zip it open to get out. And then my head was just stuck. My head is just stuck in the canvas door, and I was paralyzed. And then I woke up. That's the end. I just had to share that with someone because I read about all of these stories about people who have dreams about flying, falling, and being paralyzed. Do you ever have dreams about being paralyzed? I mean, like, I was really trapped there for like about 30 seconds of consciousness where I'm struggling to get out, but I'm just frozen. As far as George the Skyjacker, he didn't have dreams where he was paralyzed. Instead, he had dreams where he was floating, and he could kind of float but not fly. And to a certain extent, maybe you could call it paralysis, because then he would just stop being able to move, but he's still floating in the air. So that's a little bit different. And what I think that Dr. David G. Hubbard is trying to say is, dreams where you have fly show happiness, dreams where you fall and show sadness, dreams where you're paralyzed show something like stress. I think, but, all of that stuff is very abstract. What do you think about the psychology of dreams? What do you think about dream interpretations? But more importantly, let's get on to some D.B. Cooper questions. What do you think about Najeeb Halaby as a D.B. Cooper suspect? Do you believe that he deserves the 0.1 rating out of 10? I mostly think that he deserves it because, he perhaps was meeting with the President of the United States. before the skyjacking, almost maybe even concluding the meetings around the same time that Cooper's getting to Portland. And also, I think that he just has very different features that were described by the witnesses. Let me know what you think about Najeeb Halaby. 0.1, I think, is perhaps somewhat appropriate. But also, what do you think about any comments made by the Friday Beers channel? Specifically, was D.B. Cooper somebody who was extremely smart, but he tried to act like he was dumb? Did D.B. Cooper fill this case with loads of red herrings, leaving the tie behind, leaving the money at Tina Bar? And what do you think about the story of George and Gladys and hijacking a plane with a can of bug poison and a knife? Let me know anything you want. You guys have a wonderful weekend. I love you all, and I will see you on Monday for an episode about the Zodiac Killer. Until next time.